Welcome to Awesome Movie Year, the podcast where we take a look back at an awesome year for movies, which is every year. My name is Josh Bell, film critic and writer, and I'm here with my co-host.
I'm Jason Harris, comedian, filmmaker, star, witness.
All right. You're the guy that they bring out and everyone in the courtroom gasps, right?
Yeah.
That's what happens.
It's a surprise witness too, like, what? They never told us about this. We object, Your Honor.
He's going to do comedy on the stand? That's not acceptable at all.
I'm a lawyer from the early 1900s. I'm wearing a white suit and I have suspenders and a hand fan to fan myself in these hot courtrooms.
Nice. So you're the lawyer and the witness.
No, well, I objected to the witness as the lawyer. So
okay,
that's how we got there.
You're playing multiple parts here within this whole scenario.
Right.
Yeah, it's good.
Sort of a one-man show.
It's multiple people in this courtroom. And then, the bailiffs are like, order. But he doesn't really say order.
No, the judge says that. Yeah.
So then the judge is like, bailiff, I'll handle that part.
You watched a whole 2.5 hour courtroom documentary and you still can't get those roles right. So the reason maybe we're talking about court is because in this episode of our season on the films of 1996, we're taking a look at our documentary pick for the year, which is Paradise Lost: The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills. And it is largely a courtroom documentary, although there's a lot more to it, about what would become to be known as the West Memphis Three, the three teenagers who were accused of murdering 3 8-year-old boys in West Memphis, Arkansas in 1993, and the subsequent trials and all of the people surrounding the case and how it played out, at least to the point at which the trials initially concluded. And then, of course, this case became a huge thing that dragged on for many, many years. But this is really where that started, where the whole West Memphis 3 movement and pop culture phenomenon got its start, was with this film.
Yep. And it is no easier to watch now than it was the first time I saw it. And I don't mean that in a quality of filmmaking way, because it's a very good movie. It's just so hard to watch how bad everyone is wronged in this movie in one way or another.
Yeah, it is tough. I mean, and it starts out like literally the very beginning of the movie is like graphic crime scene photos of dead children. Like they are not pulling any punches in this movie at all. But I agree that while it's tough to watch, it's a fascinating film. And it was a highly acclaimed film and a successful film when it initially came out. I mean, that was why it was able to launch this whole phenomenon. It premiered at the 1996 Sundance Film Festival. And something interesting to me, I was trying to find like box office figures and stuff like that. And this was an HBO production. I mean, HBO bankrolled it. And then it premiered on HBO in June of 1996. And then after that, it went on to a theatrical release in the fall of 1996 when it grossed $249,000, which is not a lot, but I assume it didn't really matter. I mean, HBO had gotten out of it what they wanted to get out of it. But I feel like that was interesting because that's sort of the opposite of what we have now, where if there's a movie that's going to be on cable or on a streaming service and also in theaters, it's always in theaters first, because by the time it's available at home, no one is going out to theaters to see it. So I don't know. That was just a random side note that I thought was kind of interesting.
Yeah, well, let's mention Sheila Nevins there, huh? The head of HBO documentaries for probably more than 2 decades, I think. And she really set HBO up as the place, to take forward-thinking, progressive filmmaking documentaries to television outlets, I'd say.
Yeah, absolutely. She's a huge figure in HBO history and in documentary history. And of course, this movie, I mean, we'll talk about it later, but it was so influential on the style of filmmaking and the subject matter of documentaries, especially on cable and then later on streaming, that people were interested in, that these outlets would air and that would buy at festivals and stuff like that. And obviously she was a huge proponent of that and kind of led the way with that. So because it was an HBO movie, although it got a theatrical release later, I assume it wasn't eligible for any Oscars because it aired on TV first. It did win an Emmy for outstanding informational programming, though, which I think is, I don't know if that's what the category is called now, but I assume that's essentially the like feature documentary category at the Emmys. And it played at several other film festivals after Sundance before it ended up on HBO. So, and it was reviewed by Siskel and Ebert. I was trying to figure out, at like what kind of time period that was, whether that was when it aired on HBO or when it came out in theaters. And they didn't mention in their review, like where you could see the movie at the time, but they did love it. They gave it 2 thumbs up and critics were big fans of it. Roger Ebert in his written review said, "The film creates a vivid portrait of a subculture in which Satan is a central figure. Where did Damien, Jason, and Jesse, those are the 3 accused, hear about satanic rituals? Mostly in church, it would appear. Some members of this community seem to require Satanism as part of their worldview. They seize upon the devil to explain what dismays them. Their frequent theme is vengeance, and it is blood-curdling to hear relatives of the victims promise that if the defendants are released, they will track them down and kill them. We leave the film unsure about who committed the murders, but convinced that an obsession with Satanism extends here far beyond the circle of defendants."
Whew. Yeah, that's what I mean when it's tough to watch. There was one of the victims' mothers who, after Jesse Miskelly, the first part of the movie covers his trial, is given a life in prison sentence. She says, "I'm gonna send you a dress so you look all pretty in prison, for all the male prisoners." And it's a horrible thing to say. This kid's 17 maybe, and he's got an IQ of 72, so he's functioning, but not at the highest level, let's say. But at the same time, this mother thought that this was the person that killed her son. So it's like, again, everyone has so many things horrible happen to them. It's tough to fault anyone for their emotional reactions.
That's true. But, there's definitely that Old Testament sense of vengeance going on amongst these people. And you're right. You can't, thankfully, none of us know what it would be like to have your child murdered. And it's hard to criticize anyone for how they react to some kind of horrible tragedy like that. But on the other hand, you can sense that the obsession, as Ebert says, with not only with religion, but especially with the idea of Satan, with the idea of the devil corrupting people, in a way corrupts the people on both sides, because it gives them that idea that kind of vengeance or that, violence perpetrated on the murderers is the only way for justice to be served.
That's also, the obsession with Satan, but also the obsession with being a good churchgoer, right?
I think that's the point.
So, these foregone conclusions on these guys must have killed the kids because they're different, and they read whatever satanic verses are into Wiccan or activities. So the whole thing is very difficult to swallow.
Yeah, and I think that's the point, is that those are sort of 2 sides of the same coin. And these people see themselves as being churchgoers as if they're like completely the opposite of, what they imagine as like a devil worshiper or whatever, when really what they are is just sort of the reflection of that. It's the same thing, just on a slightly different perspective, at least is kind of how it seems to me. Janet Maslin in the New York Times said, "The filmmakers probed their material deeply, developing exceptionally ready access to sources on either side of the case. Their camera is everywhere, in the courtroom, in jail, at lawyers' conferences, at family gatherings, and among the press. In assembling their film, they heightened some of its drama by withholding certain facts until strategic moments. But the cumulative credibility and persuasiveness of Paradise Lost are not compromised. Without trivializing the killings they came to investigate, the filmmakers carefully study the tattered social fabric that is the backdrop for an unthinkable crime." And it is amazing watching this movie, especially when you know like the way that these filmmakers became advocates for the West Memphis Three later on, it's amazing to see the level of access they have to both sides. And no one seems like suspicious of them at this point. Like, should we let them in the courtroom? Should we let them into these meetings? Should we talk to them? Everyone is just completely open with them, which is interesting.
And I thought that too, but not because they later became advocates for the West Memphis Three, but because it was the mid 90s. Now it's this huge true crime culture and everything, but this was something very, ahead of its time in some ways. So it's for the entire community to let them in, like you said, almost full access. They shot 10 months, 79 filming days here is, defendants, victims' families, everyone, the judges, even like the lawyers reference, you got this knife from Bruce, the filmmaker, it's like they just really had all access, which is why this film is so effective.
Right. But I mean, I think you're right that obviously at this time there wasn't the same level of documentaries being made about cases like this. But at the same time, people are understanding of how they might be depicted in the media. I mean, there's multiple scenes in this movie where different people talk about how they don't trust the press, or you shouldn't trust the press, or whatever. There's even a reference to fake news at one point in this movie. So I don't think they're unaware of the way that they could be depicted or twisted in a depiction. But for whatever reason, they've decided that these documentary filmmakers are okay to trust and they'll let them in.
Yeah, I think they separate them. These are, filmmakers, not local newspapers. So they have a different level of trust with them.
Right. No, I think so. And I think maybe you're right that now those are kind of all equated because there's so many filmmakers out trying to capture these true crime stories. But it is fascinating. And I think I haven't seen the two sequels to this in a while. But, once this movie came out, then there was a clear agenda going into those other movies because those filmmakers were now actively trying to advocate for the West Memphis Three. And I think that probably changed the level of access they got to certain people and when they made those later movies.
I think you're right. But also I remember, and I agree, I haven't seen the second two since I first viewed them probably a decade or so ago. But in Revelations, I think the second one is all about John Mark Byers, right? The stepfather, and who had given them the knife, and everyone thought he must have killed him and killed the kids. And he gives them full access. He's like, come on, in Revelations, follow me around, give me a lie detector test. I'll pass it, So
right.
He's the one who became the main suspect in that film.
Right. But again, I feel like, because of that, he knows they have a perspective and agenda, and that's the way he's approaching it. Whereas in this movie, I mean, you definitely come away from the movie thinking these kids are innocent and they've been railroaded by the system. But I think the movie, it doesn't push that on you necessarily. It doesn't feel like a movie with an agenda as much as maybe the later two movies do.
I understand that, yes. And you could understand getting attached to your subjects if they are three teenage kids whose lives are now over because they are falsely convicted of a crime they didn't commit.
Yeah.
No, what I'm saying is, like, from a filmmaking standpoint, the reaction that this film garnered and helped push, the kind of freeing of these, of the West Memphis Three over a long period of time, that I think the filmmakers probably felt like they had a responsibility to the three just to continue to push their story out in the forefront.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not necessarily blaming them. I'm just saying it does affect the way the movie comes across and the way that they're able to put the movie together. And there was some, criticism of that idea of what kind of agenda they might have. Peter Stack in the San Francisco Chronicle said, Paradise Lost is artful and audacious filmmaking, but to some it may have the ring of the exploitive as well. The events of Paradise Lost were filmed as they occurred, including interviews with the dead children's family members, seized by a seething spirit of vengeance. With the cameras poking everywhere, the biggest event is the community outrage that condemned the three suspects before they ever stepped into a courthouse. The film reveals a town where poverty and inadequate education are everyday factors. Fundamentalist religion also plays a major role. Although the directors, noted for what they term nonfiction feature films, let their cameras wander, the question inevitably raised is whether the filming caused people to change their behavior while cameras rolled. If so, the film's own search for truth seems compromised. But Paradise Lost succeeds as bitter drama nonetheless. So, I mean, that's a question I think of any documentary is like, people know the cameras are there. To what degree are they changing the way they behave because of cameras? I don't think you can avoid, it's impossible to avoid that as a documentary filmmaker.
Right. And, I already mentioned John Mark Byers, who, he's singing in church and he shows off for the camera a little, but he's probably that way in real life too, So, and then, Damien Eccles, the quote unquote ringleader of the West Memphis Three, in future interviews has said there are things that he said for the camera that, he thought were like kind of jokey that came back to haunt him. So yeah, it's an honest portrayal, but yeah, the cameras are always going to affect things one way or another.
Right. And I think especially, yeah, you're right with Damien Eccles, like, he's still kind of an immature teenager and he's got this big spotlight on him and he thinks he's cool, even if he's, being accused of this terrible crime and facing the death penalty. He still has this sense of like, ooh, people are paying attention to me. I'm going to act like a cool guy. And, it's hard to blame someone like that at that age for doing that. And that's something that happens because the cameras are on him. So it's not necessarily, I don't think it makes the movie bad in any way, but it is something that kind of crosses your mind. And especially the way also they depict, this is this backwoods community and everyone here is kind of a hillbilly. And obviously these directors come in from outside in order to depict that. And I don't think the movie is condescending or anything. I think it's fair, but there is maybe a little whiff of that kind of like, look at these freaks going on here in this movie.
I didn't get that. I mean, because the characters you see are the characters in the town, these are who they are. So I didn't think that Berlinger, is that how you say it?
I think so.
Joe.
Yeah.
And Bruce
Sinofsky.
Take that one. Sinofsky, yeah.
Yeah.
Man, those are two tough ones, Berlinger and Sinofsky. I don't think they were, shining any brighter light on any of them, which I know in past documentaries, like in Crumb, we've talked about, like, are they kind of showcasing different aspects that they shouldn't be showcasing?
Right. I mean, and I think that's a question that comes up. I mean, you can ask that related to Michael Moore, too, in like Roger and Me that we talked about, which has that, the infamous the bunny slaughter lady. And you could question, like, to what degree are these filmmakers, these educated, quote, elitist, maybe filmmakers kind of looking down on their subjects. And I think you're right. They're not putting words in these people's mouths. They're not doing anything that the people aren't doing themselves. But, the fact they're choosing what to show. They have hours and hours and hours. I mean, 10 months of shooting. They have a massive amount of footage and they're putting in specifically what they want to put in. They're editing it in a certain way. So it is something that kind of crossed my mind. I don't think they're doing it disingenuously. I don't think they're out to get anyone necessarily, but it's something that I thought about as I was watching the movie.
I guess that's fair. I just don't think you can, once you start limiting these things, right, then where does it stop? And then as a documentary filmmaker, you're almost losing more content than you're getting.
Right. No, and I'm not saying they should have done it any differently. I'm just saying it's something that happens. It's inevitable that it happens and it comes across. But no, I mean, I think overall this is like an extremely well-made movie. I think this might be the third time that I've seen it because I remember watching it possibly in 1996 or pretty soon, not on HBO, maybe. I think I rented it on video or something. But when it was fairly fresh still. And for me, the big factor that kind of got me to see it was the fact that it has this Metallica music in it. This was the first movie that Metallica had ever given permission to use their music in a movie because Damien Eccles and Jason Baldwin were big Metallica fans. They authorized it. And I also was a huge Metallica fan at the time. And I probably heard about it through the Metallica fan club or something like that. And I thought, I should check this out because of them, and watched it at that time. And then I know I watched it again when the third one came out, because I think I wrote a review of that. And it's still a very powerful movie. I mean, even as much as like there's been so much saturation pop culture wise on this film with the sequels and other films that have been made and books and interviews and everything like that, this is still a very powerful movie to tell you that beginning part of the story, I think.
It is infuriating to watch. Probably more so this time for me, because the first time I didn't know all the things I know about it, and this time it's like I'm watching and I'm like, I know the outcome, but I'm like, no, it shouldn't be this outcome. But yeah, you mentioned the third one, Purgatory. That one did get nominated for a Best Documentary Oscar. It didn't win, but it was nominated. And I wanted to just mention the Metallica soundtrack. Definitely sets the mood for the movie. They did a really good job of picking the songs and placing them in very specific ways to enhance the film.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, obviously, like I said, I'm a big Metallica fan, so I'm always happy to hear their songs. But I think it does add. It wasn't just like a gimmick, like, oh, we're going to get this famous band to let us use their music because it has a connection to these people in the film. Like it works as an element of the story as well. So did you see it like in the 90s, or did you not see it until later?
No, I think I saw it when all three had hit HBO. Like when the third one came out, maybe on HBO, it was like, hey, we have all three. And I watched them all like probably 3 nights in a row, which was not the easiest thing to do. So
yeah, when the third one came out, because I was trying to refresh my memory, I think I might have watched all 3 of them in pretty quick succession as well. And yeah, it's a lot to watch at once. Even just this one, this is 2.5 hours long. It's intense to sit through this entire movie all at once. And we'll talk more about that intensity in just a moment. We'll come back and give our general thoughts on Paradise Lost. Welcome back to Awesome Movie Year. In this episode of our season on the films of 1996, we've been talking about our documentary pick, Paradise Lost, the child murders at Robin Hood Hills. As we were just saying, it's a hard movie to watch, and it's a long movie. It's an intense experience. I definitely divided it into 2 this time as I was watching it, because it's a lot to deal with at once.
I also had to segment it, and just to get the names out there, the 3 boys who were murdered: Chris Byers, Michael Moore, Steve Branch, and the West Memphis 3, the 3 accused of killing him: Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, Jesse Misskelley Jr. That's kind of what the story revolves around. We see the court case first of Jesse Misskelley Jr., then Baldwin and Eccles, and kind of encapsulating and enveloping this are all the townspeople, the family members, like we said, on both sides, and the real villains, the judge and the prosecutors.
Yeah, I mean, you could say, like, the prosecutors, obviously they're doing their jobs in the way that, like, the police present them a case and they have to prosecute it. So, I mean, the villains are maybe more the cops who coerced a confession out of Jesse Misskelley and put together a case with virtually no evidence, just found random teenagers who looked shady. I think they're more, even though we maybe don't see them as much. We see that one lead detective who, after the trial is over, says he's maybe going to run for office. But otherwise, we don't see the cops as much as the prosecutor, because we spend so much time in the courtroom. But I would blame them more so.
I think that's fair. I mean, the prosecutors had to know there were a lot of things in there that didn't add up to, but I get it. They were doing their job. But the cops, the mishandling of evidence, so for instance, the prosecutor is saying these 3, the West Memphis 3 killed these boys down in that creek, yet there's no blood in the creek, like physically it's impossible for there to be no blood. Things like that. You have, they put people on the stand, like a classmate, a female classmate who says, I overheard Jason say this. And he's like, well, no one else overheard it. So how did you hear? Things like that. It's not a good case they built. And I agree with you. The cops, at one point, they mentioned that a manager at the Bojangles chicken restaurant said there was a gentleman who was in there like an older black man who was covered in blood and like shaking, and he called the cops, and like the female officer who showed up, didn't ever like even go in to check. She just went through the drive-through to see if everything was all right. She never placed the two together. It doesn't matter that she's a female. I was just describing her. But you know, and then then the next day they came back and got blood samples and never checked the blood samples and lost them. And it's like, man, how are these guys even on trial at this point? But you're right. It also does start with the coerced confession of Jesse Misskelley there, which leads to his conviction, and then the convictions of the other two, Baldwin and Eccles.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the misconduct there is the cops, and more so than, I mean, you talk about that Bojangles thing, and like, yes, that's very irresponsible. But on the other hand, you can tell in this movie that the defense is bringing up all of these, whether it's that Bojangles thing or the possibility that John Mark Byers had some involvement because of that knife that has some blood on it. I mean, those are just as circumstantial, if not more so, than the cases against the three teenagers. But they're just trying to throw anything out there to say like, well, maybe it was this or maybe it was that. And it's understandable. But I mean, I don't think you come away from this movie thinking like, oh, that guy from the Bojangles bathroom is the real killer or anything like that.
No, like I said, I think a lot of people thought that John Mark Byers was the real killer after this, which now nobody does, you know.
Right.
But the the judge, and I remember this from the other two, every time that they David Burnett was his name, who of course went on to become a politician. What a surprise. Every time that they presented new evidence or, hey, there's new techniques now for DNA, or, inconclusive evidence from last trials, or, we didn't have proper representation. Every time they brought it back to him for a new trial, he refused all of that. So he was a real asshole, and he sucks, and I don't like him.
Yeah, he doesn't. You don't see much really any of that in this movie, but they do have a lot of shots of him sitting at the bench, kind of looking bored or having his head in his hands or something, where he seems like he's sort of dismissive of the whole idea of this and wants to just get it over with and convict them. So you can see how that'll play out later, I think.
Yeah, I had read that Dan Stidman, who was Misskelley's, lawyer, who later also went on to become a judge. At once he was walking past like the judge's chambers, and the judge told like the jury foreman, "Hey, we're gonna break for lunch," and the jury foreman said, "Well, we're almost, we've almost reached a conclusion." And the judge was like, "Yeah, but you're gonna need to eat before we get to sentencing." So he's already leading, if that's true, he's leading the jury in the way that he wants the verdict to go. So I don't like him, Josh.
No, I mean, I don't blame you. And there's definitely not, there's a lot of people to dislike in this movie, certainly. A lot of people who have bad motivations. And even though, I mean, the parents of the victims, certainly, especially John Mark Byers, as we've talked about, who as you said, no longer is a suspect in any way and was really kind of vindicated by later films. They all come off, they come off pretty poorly, all of these parents. And yet throughout this time, I was thinking, they do deserve the sympathy because their children have been murdered. Even if these teenagers didn't do it, someone did it. And that's a horrible thing. And it makes you act irrationally. Certainly.
Yeah, I think that's basically what it comes down to, is you're looking for, in such a tragedy, they're probably looking for anything to grasp onto. And there's a very, a scene that kind of shakes you out of your seat where John Mark Byers, I think he takes, is it Todd Moore, the father of Michael Moore, to the gun range?
Yeah, one of the other fathers, yeah.
Yeah, and they're shooting, and he goes, this one's for you, Damien, and he shoots a target, and this one's for you, Jason. And he's like, oh, Jesse, I only wounded you. And he shoots the target like a few more times. And, things like that are just man, there's no black and white. It's just all gray here. But the other thing about John Mark Byers is he became another advocate to free the West Memphis Three as he learned more of the truth of what happened.
Yeah, I mean, he's not the only one. I think at least one other parent has become or had become an advocate for them to be released. And but obviously here they don't have full access to the information that would later come out, and so it's hard to blame them for this. But you certainly do. I mean, John Mark Byers comes across as kind of a crazy weirdo in this movie, and the filmmakers give him enough rope to hang himself, or however you want to say it. But of course, the point of this movie is that we shouldn't judge people for being crazy weirdos and assume that that means that they're murderers. And that's what happened to the West Memphis Three, to the teenagers.
Right. And the reason they also focus on him is because he's very charismatic. He is a showman, right? Like,
Yeah.
We see him singing in church, and the first time we see him is like kind of this panning shot in the creek where he's almost preaching about, these are where the murders took place, where they took, the lives of these three innocent boys. And, so he does become a magnetizing figure no matter what you feel about him. As opposed to Jason Baldwin is so quiet of the West Memphis Three, you feel like he's so far in over his head that like he doesn't even. I don't know if they all comprehend what they're in for. Like, hey, yeah, we're in a murder trial, but this can't be real, is what it feels like.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're all in over their heads. And just because Damien Eccles, and like we were sort of saying earlier, he plays up for the camera and he wants to come across as like cool and sophisticated or whatever, but he's clearly in over his head too. And there's a moment at one point where he's talking to his lawyers about his testimony, and they say like, well, why did you say this or why did you say that? And he's like, oh, I wasn't even really paying attention.
Right.
Like, he doesn't realize that you can't not pay attention when you're on the stand and you're on trial for murder. Like, that's the time to pay attention.
Right. And so, like we said, we start with this Jesse Misskelley Jr. trial, and clearly the police have led him to this confession that, oh, yeah, I didn't actually kill them, but I was with Jason and Damien, and I held one of them down while those two killed these boys, and it's like, he says like he left school at lunchtime, and then they get to like, so you're in the woods in the middle of the night with these guys, right? And it's like they're just pushing for whatever they want, and it's sad, and it's kind of interesting because Jesse Misskelley, they do offer him a plea deal if he's willing to testify against the other two, but he sticks to his guns and he says, I was coerced into my confession, and he never testifies against his friends, which I think is admirable, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely it is. And there's that scene where his mother or his stepmother who raised him says that, I'll be there in the courtroom, and if you lie on the stand, you'll have to look at me and see, and I'll be looking at you. And that's a very powerful moment there.
And that reminds me of this other scene where it's where it's his father and his father's girlfriend now, and the father's girlfriend says, well, if he's convicted, we'll never give him money. We'll never send him anything to make his life better. And his father says, I'll send him money. Like, he's my son, no matter what happens, So yeah, you almost wonder like what this type of thing had to like have lasting effects on this town for decades, I would think.
Yeah. I mean, this is really like the number one thing that this town is known for, I would say. Although I will say, like, randomly, I watched this movie recently called Arkansas. It's sort of like a comedic-ish thriller with Clark Duke and Liam Hemsworth. And Vince Vaughn plays this like drug kingpin character. And there's all these flashbacks to the 80s as he rises to power. And they all take place in West Memphis. So I guess that's another thing that was there was people selling drugs and creating little drug empires. But yeah, I mean, I think if you say West Memphis to anyone, even probably who lives in Arkansas, they think of the West Memphis Three. That's what the town is known for,
Well, Josh, we're all wondering now, is Arkansas a good movie?
It's an all right movie. Yeah, I don't think anyone is wondering that. But if you would like to know, it's kind of amusing. It's a little derivative of Elmore Leonard and Coen Brothers and stuff, but it's got some good performances. And it showcases West Memphis, so that's important.
Right. So yeah, I mean, we've kind of covered the large scale of this, and one filmmaking technique that I think is effective is that we never hear Berlinger or Sinofsky. It's always the rephrasing of the question by the subjects who are being interviewed, And so you really feel like you're kind of getting the story told to you by the people who are being interviewed as opposed to the directors. And that those kind of first person interviews, along with that courtroom footage, which, I mean, man, what access they had, and along with the kind of breaks with the Metallica soundtrack, that's kind of the spine of this whole movie and how it sets its course.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's important to mention the filmmaking here is this isn't just a news story. It's not just a news report, which, I think some of the worst true crime documentaries just do that. They just throw together news footage and they call it a movie or a TV show. But this is a cinematic presentation, and there's a lot of choices made, like I was saying before, in terms of editing and in terms of framing and the way that they present it, as you say, without their sort of editorializing. Even though you can clearly come away from this movie with a perspective about whether these three teenagers are innocent, they're not directly telling you that. And I do think that's important. And the fact that, I mean, this movie is long and it can be a grind to sit through at times, but the fact that they go through things so methodically and they show you every little step of Jesse Miskelly's trial and then every little step of the other trial, and it's a very procedural kind of movie, I think that's important to give you the clear sense of what's going on. They're not trying to sensationalize this stuff. And it was interesting to me watching this again. I realized, like, Damien Eccles, who is the famous figure, he's the big West Memphis 3, the one who's most well known. You barely even see him until like halfway through this movie, when we start talking to him in interviews and stuff. So they're really methodical about the way that they build this.
Yeah, the first half is Miskelly and the second half is Eccles and Baldwin. And I think, like you said, you're getting this access to what goes on in the courtroom, but not just that, you're getting the access to strategy sessions with the lawyers. You're getting lawyer conversations with the West Memphis 3. So yeah, they paint a very full picture. I think we've probably really kind of expressed our admiration for this movie. Should we give it a rating, Josh, based on 5 Bojangles chicken meals?
Oh, that was I was gonna go darker, but let's do that with the chicken meals instead.
Yeah, I'm glad I took that one, huh?
Yeah. What would you rate it out of 5 chicken meals?
I think the first time I watched it, I would have given it 5 because it was such a powerful piece. This time I'm giving it 4 for the things that we've talked about, that it's hard to rewatch, man. So, but it's a very, very good film, and you should watch this and the other 2. So I'm going to go 4 Bojangles meals.
All right. Yeah. I mean, I think it is a very good film too. I'm going to give it 3.5. I think even though the length is justified, it definitely is a grind to watch. And in a way, because of the existence of so many other representations of the story, it now feels sort of incomplete. That's not really a fault of the movie because it was complete as of the moment that it was made, but there's so much more afterwards. But it is very much worthwhile. And I think it has that power still, even though we know so much more about what happened later. You can just watch this movie and really get that sense of the injustice of what went on. So I definitely recommend it, even though I don't know that I recommend watching it like 3 times as I have, but do watch it one time at least. So Dave, had you ever seen this one?
I haven't. I've just always known of it as the movie with the Metallica music.
Well, that it is. Yes.
Hey, Dave, no one in this movie has hair like you.
Yeah, no one that we can compare Dave to this time.
Yeah. But Josh, before we get to our next segment, do you feel like after watching this you would rewatch the next 2?
No. I mean, especially because having seen the next 2, I feel like they're also sort of incomplete. Especially the second one is really just a bridge. There's nothing quite resolved in that movie. And I think even in the third one was being made like as their final sort of appeal was going through, and they had to rush to include the fact that they eventually got released. So that movie, again, it's been a while, but I remember that movie also feeling a little incomplete. So I think, and we'll talk about this, but to me, I think maybe the best thing is to watch this movie and then to watch West of Memphis, the Amy Berg movie that encapsulates the entirety of the case so that you get a full sense of it. But we can get right back into that when we talk about the legacy of Paradise Lost. Welcome back to Awesome Movie Year. In this episode of our season on the films of 1996, we've been talking about the documentary Paradise Lost, directed by Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky. See how I pronounced that so well there, Jason? We've really talked throughout about the legacy of this movie because it's kind of hard not to talk about it. The West Memphis 3 case overall, which dragged on for the next 15 years, is the main legacy of this movie that would not have gotten its attention were it not for this movie.
Yeah, this helped free the West Memphis 3. They spent 18 years in jail. It's documented that Damien Echols was raped and abused in jail, and just a horrible situation, obviously. And like we said, Burnett would never take them on for a retrial. And then eventually they got off on an Alford plea, which means they're saying like, hey, we're saying we're not guilty, but we understand that you had enough evidence to convict us, right? Which I know Miss Kelly and Baldwin said the only reason they took that was because Eccles was possibly going to get executed if they didn't take it. They were willing to fight till the end to prove their innocence. But, and then of course, after the Alford plea, that's when Burnett says, well, I think they should have had a retrial, not just a plea out, like, you piece of shit asshole, David Burnett, But you're right. That is the biggest legacy, is this helped free 3 innocent people. The other major legacy that I see is this huge true crime entirety genre of entertainment, whether it's podcasts or Netflix limited series or all over HBO, everywhere. It all started, or this was the kind of spike in the ground that lit that fire early on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we talked last season about Roger and Me and how influential that movie is. And I feel like this movie is probably as influential. I mean, it's really the kickstart to an entire genre, which these days feels like it's, 50 to 60% of all documentaries made are in this genre. So that is a huge, huge legacy of it. And I think they do, as we were kind of talking about before, I think they do a better job in this movie of making it a movie, of making it a full, complete, cinematic piece of art, versus what a lot of true crime documentaries do now, because there's such this gold rush to make them as quickly as possible and to cover every case that there is. This movie took a lot more care, I think, than a lot of those others do.
Right. And you see that also in podcasts. The first 2 seasons of Up and Vanish is a very good true crime podcast, are great, but then they signed a deal with maybe Oxygen or something, and now they're putting out weekly episodes that are contained, and it's this isn't good. It takes time to craft good stories a lot of the time.
Yeah. And I mean, we should say also that Joe Berlinger himself has become this huge figure in the world of true crime documentaries. And he's involved in a lot of TV series, including there's one recently, and I think maybe the current season is still airing or just finished airing, called Wrong Man on Stars. And I haven't seen this stuff, and I'm not saying it's good or it's not good, but he is certainly part of that machine right now that's churning out tons of true crime content.
Now, the other things we should talk about, you had mentioned West of Memphis. I never watched that movie. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I saw it when it came out. It's from 2012, so it's been a while. But like I said, I think the advantage that West of Memphis has is that it was made after sort of everything was over, after they had put in that Alford plea and they had gotten out. And so that movie is able to kind of summarize everything that happened over this many, many, many years. Whereas the Paradise Lost series is tracking these things as they're happening. And so they're never able to really get to a conclusion. So I think especially the Paradise Lost sequels really just feel like, oh, here's some more stuff. Whereas this movie feels really like a self-contained piece. It ends with the conviction. As far as they were concerned, that was the end of the story. They didn't realize what would happen later. So this movie feels a little more complete. And that's why I'm saying I think if you watch this and then you watch West of Memphis, you'll get a full sense of the case, and it might not take you quite as much time. But it has been a while since I saw that movie, so I can't give you details on it.
And what about Devil's Knot, which was first a book, kind of written around this case and then became a narrative film by Adam McGoyan?
Yeah, that I haven't seen, but it was very poorly reviewed at the time it came out. And I think, that's not to say that there couldn't be an interesting like narrative film take on this. But it sounds like that wasn't it. But I never saw it. Did you see it?
I did not, nor did I see Metallica, Some Kind of Monster, the documentary directed by these two.
That I did see because, as I've said, I'm a big Metallica fan. And that's a really fascinating film. I mean, it's very different than this, obviously, because it's not a crime documentary. It's about, Metallica in the process of recording their album Saint Anger and when they're in therapy. But it is it's really one of the most interesting like music documentaries that's been made because of the psychological approach that it takes and the way that it deconstructs these like macho heavy metal guys and shows their sensitive side and the songwriting process. So I think that's a really interesting film. Sadly, I have also seen Blair Witch 2, which was one of two narrative films that Joe Berlinger has directed. And that's not a good movie. But he also made that Ted Bundy movie with Zac Efron recently for Netflix, which is his other narrative film. But that one I haven't seen.
One thing I missed when we were talking about it was one scene I wanted to bring up was there's a scene with Stevie Branch's family, and they all say that they could never forgive these guys. They could never forgive the killer. And then the grandfather, we've kind of, talked about the negatives of religion and everything. And then the grandfather just kind of slowly and methodically says, it's in our religion to forgive people. They're obviously Christian here. This is what Jesus wants. And as hard as it's going to be, we're going to have to forgive them because that's what we believe. And I thought that was a really effective scene and showed another side of this thing.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that scene is a good contrast to the scene that you were talking about earlier with Jesse Miss Kelly's father's girlfriend, where she's adamant about that he could never, if he really did this, he could never be forgiven. We'd have to cut ties with him completely. And this is the flip side on one of the victim's relatives talking about how actually, as Christians, we should be forgiving. So that is a way that the movie has that kind of balance and nuance that it doesn't always have, but in those moments it does. So I think that's a powerful scene to point out. And as far as legacy wise,
I got one more thing to say. I don't know if you know, I think you know this, Josh. So I wrote about music for magazines like Las Vegas Weekly for probably a decade or so. And when Eddie Vedder was on his solo tour, he played the Palms Out Here. And Eddie Vedder was obviously a very vocal supporter and advocate of getting the West Memphis 3 out. And at the concert, either sitting right next to me or right behind me was Jason Baldwin. And it was very soon after they got out, I think. I mean, I'd have to look it up. Maybe it was a couple of years, but this concert was a great concert. And Eddie Vedder kind of pointed out Baldwin and mentioned the case and everything. And it became transcended. I mean, it was one of the few 5-star reviews I've ever given. In a live concert. It was a great concert, but the emotion that filled the room with this situation and with this guy who was in jail for 18 years, now getting to enjoy his freedom and his life, it was really emotional. And it was really nice that he was a sweet man, and you could tell he was just so thankful to be living again.
Yeah, that's an amazing experience. I think I remember talking about that concert with you, and I wish I had been able to go to it. But the other thing, you mentioned Eddie Vedder, and Damien Echols actually co-wrote lyrics to a Pearl Jam song on an album that I think was released. I think it was when he was still in prison, actually. But he co-wrote, I forget the name of the song. It's on their self-titled album with the avocado cover. And they certainly all were, I mean, not the only ones. There were a lot of advocates. And I think maybe in the later Paradise Lost movies, and definitely in West of Memphis, you see all these celebrity advocates, people like Eddie Vedder. And I know Natalie Maines from the Dixie Chicks is another one who was a huge advocate for them. So it became this whole celebrity thing. There was a benefit album maybe for them. I mean, just the pop culture presence of it. I think even I was just seeing Damien Echols did a guest voice on some Netflix animated series like just this year. So he's still got this weird pop culture connection going on for him, even after years after he's been released. So we should mention maybe also, we talked about Joe Berlinger having this long true crime career. Bruce Sinofsky worked a bit in TV as well, but he passed away in 2015. So he hasn't made any more documentaries since then, weirdly enough.
It's tough to work in television after you die.
It is tough. It's not impossible, but it's tough.
But hey, man, he left a legacy, right?
Absolutely, he did. I mean, if nothing else, the movies that he made with Joe Berlinger, these 3 movies, the Metallica movie that we mentioned, and their first film, Brother's Keeper, which is another true crime film that I haven't seen, but I think was very well regarded as well.
Yeah, that's another what do we want to call it? Like iconic moment in the movement of not only documentary, but you're saying true crime documentary.
Yeah, they certainly, the 2 of them created this body of work that has a massive influence still to this day. So that is Paradise Lost, and that's this episode of Awesome Movie Year. You can follow us on social media.
You can. We're at awesomemovieyear.com, Awesome Movie Pod on the Twitter, Awesome Movie Year on Facebook and Instagram. Instagram's not very good.
No.
I mean, I like Instagram. I'm saying our Instagram's not very good.
It's
personally, you can follow me, Jason Harris Comedy on Facebook and Instagram. My Instagram's good. J Harris Comedy on Twitter. Hey, guess who tweeted me this past week? Kevin Smith, who we've talked about in past episodes. So that's kind of fun. And then I'm also at goforjason.com. It's not a good website.
No, it's almost as bad as our Awesome Movie Year Instagram, I think.
I'm going to combine the 2.
Yeah, there you go. I am at joshbellhateseverything.com. Josh Bell Hates Everything on Facebook, and at Signal Bleed on Twitter, where Kevin Smith is not tweeting at me, but that's okay. And you can listen to our producer, David Rosen's awesome podcast, Piecing It Together.
I tweet at you sometimes, Josh.
That's true. You're no Kevin Smith, though.
That's true. Well, you can follow us over on all the social medias at Piecing Pod and listen to us wherever you listen to this great podcast.
This is such a great podcast. Jason, what's on our next episode?
It's the Josh pick, everybody. What? Josh's pick of 1996, John Sayles Lone Star.
Yeah, I'm excited. It has actually been, I picked it, but it's been a while since I've seen it. So that'll be an interesting discussion. Tune in next time to hear about Lone Star. And thanks for listening to Awesome Movie Year.
Thank you for listening to Awesome Movie Year. Make sure to follow Awesome Movie Year on Facebook, at Awesome Movie Pod on Twitter, and at Awesome Movie Year on Instagram. And if you like the show, review us and rate us with 5 stars on Apple Podcasts.
And all points west.